Okay. So we want to welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We are starting off, this is day one of our COVID Action Week. And day one, we're going to highlight all of our attorneys and our executive director as we discuss Chapter 607 and COVID-19 as a presumptive illness as we've requested of the governor. We're going to go over some of the portions of the executive order that was issued that talked about medical reimbursements. And so we'll go into detail on that here in a few minutes. And just to go over a couple of the other things we'll be doing this week, tomorrow we'll go over a summary of all of the actions we've taken since March, requesting the governor issue an executive order to make COVID-19 a presumptive illness, and all the activities and events that we've had leading up to today. And this week we'll continue that. Thursday, we'll have a legislative Zoom where the key legislators who have supported CLEAT in this will be joining us in a Zoom and discussing all of their work that they've done in order to help us get in touch with the governor and get this message out there, sending letters and talking with their constituents. And on Friday, that will be our memorial, where we'll have a remembrance walk with the families of the fallen officers who've succumbed to COVID-19 in the state of Texas. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and put up a image of the document I just referred to, so everyone can take a look at it. Can everyone see that?
Yes. Yes.
So this is the portion where Governor Abbott, appears to be in response to CLEAT's initial request, which was back in March, which goes into some detail, like I said, about medical cost sharing, reference COVID-19 and first responders. So with that being said, I'll introduce our executive director, Charlie Wilkeson, and he can go into speaking with our attorneys.
Okay, we apologize from the public affairs side for the glitch that we experienced earlier, and we're ready to roll now. Nothing would make us happier than to focus on the other issues at hand in law enforcement today. And it has been 6 months since we began asking for the presumptive order, executive order from Governor Abbott here in Texas to make sure that we didn't experience the very thing that the families are experiencing today. So nothing would make me happier than to have fully accepted this letter that reflects back to 607. That would have been a victory for law enforcement officers that are suffering from COVID. CLEAT would have been proud to have shared in that news with everyone. And we're not just being contrary. The problem is now that we've had a large number of deaths, and CLEAT also believes that the correction officers inside of the prison system are in the greater body of law enforcement. Where else are they going to be? Who else is going to claim those? So we've had deaths in police officer deaths. We've had county peace officer deaths. We've had county jailer deaths, and as well as the correction officers in the prisons. So these sad numbers are mounting up. And as we predicted, Chapter 607 doesn't work. And lots of these families have been told no. Some have been told nothing. And the majority of them certainly have not received any benefits. So the reason that we asked for presumptive, and CLEAT was joined by over 40, I believe, legislators, bipartisan legislators that have written to the governor asking for a presumptive executive order. So this isn't something that's just a labor union complaining. what we predicted would happen was that if you didn't have a presumptive order, the same way the feds have said that it is a presumptive disease, then we would have to go case by case, and each family would have to prove up that the death occurred because of COVID-19. And as I had said over and over, that the family is ill-equipped, even the department's ill-equipped, and going back and saying, oh, they must have been exposed on this particular shift. And they must have been exposed to this particular case, and that must have been how they got COVID, and that must be the reason that caused their death. And so the insurance companies are co-conspirators in a sense that each of these political subdivisions are figuring out a way to say no. And so if you look at a Republican sheriff who died of COVID-19 in line of duty death, and not only did they not say that it was line of duty, out in Lynn County, the commissioner's court had to come behind the scenes afterward and get money and permission to bring his body home, and just standard things that we would consider a funeral escort for someone who'd fallen in line of duty or even not in line of duty to be standard operating procedure. When you look at then in Nueces County, where a sergeant in the sheriff department said to them, here is a letter from my physician. I've had cancer and chemo, and they don't think I should go in the jail. And they said, thank you for bringing the letter. Now go to the jail. And he is dead. And so as this number increases, then the inaction and of the executive order, the lack of that executive order does exactly as we predicted and pushes us as regular folk out there trying to prove up that the loved one actually died of COVID that they contracted as a disease. It's unfair and unjust. So the letter 607, which we're the reason we're here today, is incorrect. And so it's not easy for us or fun for us to tell the governor and their attorneys in the state that doesn't stretch that far, and that they either made a mistake in believing that it did, or this was just an intentional way to punt back to the political subdivisions and force the melee that we have now. So anyway, I want to mention that this isn't just a labor union idea that Charlie's just decided the governor didn't do enough. Our advisors in this are some of the most respected folks in police labor and in law that we know. And we're joined by our senior most attorneys at CLEAT, and we have, I believe, 26 others in the legal division outside of these guys here. But Craig Dietz is of counsel to CLEAT. Michael Rickman is a corporate counsel, and the general counsel is Robert Leonard. And so I will start, let's start with Craig because he's at the top of my screen. And you guys can weigh in here and explain that this is not the East Texas State University political science degree claiming practicing law that somehow 607 doesn't cover, because it literally doesn't cover, Craig, and we're seeing the evidence that it doesn't. So therefore, we're still in need of either a presumptive act by the governor, or we're going to have to go to the legislature and pass a law.
Well, yeah, Charlie, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, if you just look at the language of the statute, the problem that you have is that this is COVID is a disease nobody knew about in 2019, which was the last time that the legislature met. And clearly, although respiratory illnesses are supposedly covered by the presumptive statute, you have to prove a couple of things that we can't prove here. You have to show that it's a respiratory illness that has a statistically positive correlation with service as a firefighter, peace officer, or emergency medical technician. Obviously, we don't have any kind of statistical evidence like that for a disease that didn't exist before the year 2020. So we really do need some kind of action, either legislative or executive order, that makes it very clear that they intend that COVID, like other respiratory illnesses, be subject to this presumption so that our folks can get benefits.
That's been the advice that our senior attorneys have shared with us. And Mike, Michael Rickman, been with CLEAT over 20 years. I'd like for Mike to share his thoughts on the letter as well.
Well, thank you. Not only I agree with Craig, he's got the statute right there and has quoted it, but our letters we're receiving from the carriers are designating the fact that the line of duty, it was not a line of duty of death, and that Chapter 607 does not apply specifically. So with the governor's letter, is a direct conflict with what the insurance carriers are doing anyway. We have a situation, as you said, in Lynn County, where this very, we're playing this out, these very set of facts are coming to pass. But we are trying to formulate our argument and try to get the carrier to change their mind, to point out a few things about I guess the fact that the first responders in this situation, the sheriff's deputies and more and rise to the top, the sheriff himself or herself, as the case may be, but that they are more likely, and the disease itself is more indigenous to first responders getting the disease, as opposed to just the general public themselves, because the first responders come in contact with those that may have it, and they bring it back to one central location, which is the police department or sheriff's office, as you well know.
So the very fact that they can't shelter in place and they have to continue to work because they're under order, and then they've been directed to work even though they may have had a compromised immune system, this really leaves the state of Texas and those political subdivisions out there fully exposed from these actions. Because if someone has a compromised immune system and they're telling you that, and they have medical evidence that that's the case, then to order them into the COVID jail in Nueces County, for example, was a death sentence, and it was done without hesitation.
And many of these departments, Charlie, are not giving out the proper PPE, the personal protective equipment, which, as you know, that you've done with our spreading all over the state. But they're not a lot of these departments don't have still the proper equipment, and they're putting these officers, these jailers, into the very den of lions that you're referring to.
And we've had other directions where chiefs have said they believe that the barrier of the mask intimidates the public.
Absolutely.
And they've ordered people not to wear a mask. One case, for example, was in Temple, Texas, where the police chief literally put out there as an order not to wear the mask in certain circumstances, because it created a barrier, a negative connotation for the department. So, Bob, I want to go back to Robert Leonard, who's our general counsel, and kind of summate. I'd like for each of you to speak to the fact that you're in agreement in your advice to us that this doesn't work.
Oh, absolutely, Charlie. I think for the general public, what they have to understand is that by giving this a presumptive designation, the most important thing in all of this is that it shifts the burden to the employer. It's no longer incumbent upon the employee to prove that they got this at work. It's now up to the employer to prove that the employee did not get it at work. And in receiving benefits, the governor's letter talks about medical reimbursement, but workers' compensation covers a whole lot more than just that. It covers pay and other things that are going to be important to a family, especially if that individual is the sole provider, they have no way of providing benefits and pay and other things to their family if they're not given the workers' comp designation that this was a line of duty illness. So I think that the governor's letter falls far short of where it needs to be. We do need a designation of presumption. This has been done throughout the country. There are a number of governors who have stepped up and have covered first responders. And I think that our governor needs to do that. Charlie, referencing your example earlier, Nueces County, to send somebody in who has been medically documented to have a compromised immune system, I think goes beyond just negligence. I think it borders on criminal. I mean, that person was basically sent into a situation. Jails are just a giant petri dish. The number of positive cases for detention officers, corrections officers throughout the state is staggering. And for them to send somebody in with a compromised immune system is reckless.
We certainly agree with that. And in the end, I think if you look out at the total number of cases across the state, the lost work, there's going to be lost wages, and of course then the loss of life. And Jen, I think Jennifer, we're at what's our number of line of duty deaths that we've chronicled so far?
We're approaching 40. I believe 39 was this week.
Okay, so if you were to take 40 officers across the state that have been killed by gunfire, by a loaded gun, or any other capacity of line of duty, we would have had a heroes parade for those families, and they would have gotten an opportunity to see how much their loved one meant to the state. And in this circumstance, they have to go back and fight for the elementary promise, not just of the $500,000 from the state of Texas or the additional federal benefit, but just for the honor of the fact that they couldn't shelter in place. They were directed to go to work. They had no other choice. They did their duty, and now we've turned our back completely on them. And our only answer back then is this letter that says, okay, well, you can medically be reimbursed from 607. The governor's office has actually told reporters no one has been declined. Well, I don't know what you call it then. So since you haven't been declined, then does your family have the paperwork, and has it been declared in the line of duty? So by punting this back to the local political subdivision, we create this hypocrisy. In politics in Texas, such an open sore for it, because we're saying that we're going to limit how political subdivisions can raise taxes. We're going to limit what they can do with their expenditures. We're going to give them all kinds of limitations as political subdivisions. But when it comes to the fallen of a pandemic that came roaring through Texas, and we opened back up too soon, and we didn't prepare them with PPE. There was actually a press conference when the governor said there's an abundance of PPE. And so the abundance of PPE that we had at the time was CLEAT going into our coffers and spending the money and putting our own people at risk going across the state. And we spent a lot of time and money getting PPE out to people that, regardless of their union membership, anywhere across the state, they would tell us that they needed it. So we believe that in law enforcement, CLEAT members, officers paying their dues, we believe we helped to flatten the curve. We did more than our part. It wasn't even in our bailiwick as a task. We're representing them legally. We're representing them in other ways. We're representing them as their advocate. We were out there doing the job that the state and the federal government should have done. We sent a letter to the White House, we sent a letter to the governor, both are U.S. senators, and said, if there's a stockpile, please tell us where it is now. That's in March that we did that. And we said, if there is a stockpile, we'll buy from you. Instead, we had to go out on the international market and buy it as well. I'm so glad we did. And I'm so glad the commitment of the board of directors that saw the need And we stepped in places in law enforcement agencies where no one was doing anything because they were paralyzed and couldn't. Can you imagine that your only job was to respond to the public safety? That was priority number one. And in any time of state administration, the governor, that is priority number one. So what we do, there was no PPE, there was no preparation. Then there was this ill wind of opening back up too fast. We forced officers out there all the time to do their job, and they're glad to do it. They're sworn to do it, and they're duty bound to do it, and they did it. And what do? We order them into a petri dish, as you said, Counselor. And so, of course, the result is that we are on, right now, we're at a 39 line of duty deaths in Texas because of COVID-19. If we were talking about any other statistic, there would be complete outrage. The public's absolutely terrified and still concerned about their own health. We're approaching this from the back end of everything. The governor had a really great opportunity in March when we stood outside the Capitol. We asked with our hat in our hand. We've been absolutely good stewards of the relationships that we've had. We've asked nicely. And so at this point, we're so far in that if a presumptive order doesn't come in the month of September, then we won't be able to recover from this. So bill filing is going to be after Election Day for pre-file and in November for incumbents. And we've had a number of people say they will author this legislation. We have a number of people in both parties say they will. We've had a number of people in both parties say they will join with people in the other party. And so it's strange that we can see this horrible need, this tragedy here, and then crickets from the insurance side and crickets from the person that could make a difference here. So we'll use this time here to answer any questions that we might have had. We had a late start there because of Facebook. And Jen, why don't you tell people where we are in case they can rewatch this later or how it's going to go. We're on YouTube and Facebook.
Posted on Facebook right now. There's a link, and when you click on the link, it sends you to our YouTube live. So we're really in both spots right now. We did have a few questions, but I'm glad that a couple of you mentioned the PPE issue, because we actually had a reporter earlier today mention that their colleagues were reviewing our media advisory and made comments of officers being out and not wearing masks, and that would somehow make them, not eligible for something like this. And so I educated them on the fact that they don't have the proper PPE in many areas, and that we provided that to a lot of them. So I'm glad that was mentioned. A lot of the questions on here have been answered, such as how many officer deaths have we had? Janice was asking, are there any letters available? Yes, we have all the letters that were written by state representatives and senators, and we can send those to you via email. And I think we posted them on our Facebook page as well, on the CLEAT Facebook page. The only question here that I have for the attorneys was Maggie. She's a reporter I spoke with earlier this morning. She was wondering if the lawyers could address how the funding for doing this would work, and also address any potential downsides of making COVID a presumptive illness, if there are any.
Well, I think that the funding issue will have to be taken up by the legislature, and Charlie can speak to that better than we can. But the legislature is capable of taking care of these families quite easily. We're not talking about trillions of dollars. We're talking about, as Charlie pointed out, had these individuals been killed in the line of duty in any other fashion, whether through a firearm or even in a fleet accident, responding to an emergency call for help, the state would provide these same benefits. What we're asking is that they recognize that COVID is taking the lives of peace officers, detention officers, correction officers across the state, the same way that an officer killed in the line of duty with a firearm or through a fleet accident or other manner. We're asking that they be given the same recognition and that the state provide for their families the way they would for any officer killed in the line of duty.
The money's already allocated inside of the statutes that exist. These people already have insurance. They're already covered by insurance, and they already have the same death benefit that they would have from any other death. And so we're talking about specifically the nearly 40 families that are out there that haven't received what's due them, and haven't, their names won't go on the wall. I don't know what magic mojo happy talk we're having here, but if they're not decidedly declared line of duty deaths, they will not go on the monument, because TCO doesn't have authority to reach back and make decisions on what's a line of duty death. Is the authority to take the line of duty death that's been declared, locally, and move through. And if the governor had given us this presumptive, then there'd be no question about it. And that's what's missing. But the money's already been allocated. It exists today. There'd be no new need for expenditure. What we're talking about is just taking care of an obvious problem. And when you declare that you've taken care of it, then it needs to be true.
I think in addition, I'd just like to add this, Charlie, is that we've been talking about all along, 607 works hand in hand, I believe, in conjunction with workers' comp. And the fact still remains that 607 has reimbursement of medical expense type and immunization type expenses to the family, even to the spouses and kids, but at the same time, workers' comp, or on the other hand, a workers' comp gives other financial support to the family. Not everybody, of course, passes away, so some have to recover, and some of these folks, these officers, you just don't recover in a week or two. Some are taking month or 2 months and have residual effects. So that's where workers' comp effect comes in to provide stability to the home, to the family, so that the wife and children don't have to wonder where they're going to be able to make their rent, going to be able to buy groceries or put clothes on their backs and shoes on their feet, that type of thing. The everyday needs of the family, that's where workers' comp comes, or the aspect, the funding part of the workers' comp comes in. The line of duty death is very important, but there's a lot more that have been denied the workers' comp rather than the line of duty death benefit, and there's a lot of families out there suffering.
Any other questions for us before we go?
The only other one, Charlie, is from a reporter that just came in asking what you think, what's the reason that, or what's holding the governor back from officially making this an executive order?
Well, you have to be a literalist when you're dealing with the office of the governor, and so we have to take them at their word. So they've said, A, this will fix it. We say our attorneys have researched and done due diligence, and they say, of course, that it doesn't match. So then, of course, their fallback is no family has been denied benefits. So that's going to wind up just being insurance talk. If we look at other states where they've had this fight, like Utah, for example, where they did a presumptive bill, the people that came out of the woodwork and opposed to that were the far right think tanks. They were the big international mutual insurance companies, and they decried the idea of having a new entitlement. Well, an entitlement is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is taking care of Texas finest and their families that has been promised already in statute, in both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. But during a pandemic, a brand new disease that no one ever saw, and the legislature's not in session, then it's left to the executive, it's left to the governor to make that call, make that decision. And so you would have to ask the governor's office why. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to take this time today. All of us want this to work. We'd be glad to be the cheerleader for something that did work. We're not just grundled. We've been on the team. The problem is this is not true. This letter that's been handed out, and it's also not true that everything will just be okay when you punt back to the political subdivisions who have carriers who intend to set up on the no question. They initially, an insurance carrier's job is to find a reason to say no and deny benefits, and that's what's happening over and over. It's just an incredible tragedy that we'd be going through this now when these families need it the most. So leadership is about doing the difficult things. And the fact is that if emergency orders involving the Second Amendment, which all of us believe are very important, well, we had an emergency order that the sale of guns wouldn't be impeded. Churches were allowed to be open during the pandemic. And that absolutely secures people's right, to worship. You could buy alcohol in Texas. Gosh, that got its own emergency order. But COVID-19 disease impacting first responders, and we've talked a lot about police officers, deputy sheriffs, jailers, and we've talked about the prison employees. But we haven't talked about firefighters and EMTs. They're not covered either. And so that's we're fighting for all those things. So if you look at it holistically, this is the impeding of insurance companies, big money and interest. They're the big silent partners out there, and they have literally slammed the door on this issue. So we're going to open it back up, because the legislature is going to be closer to the folks out there, and they're going to want to pass this. And to have, both Republicans in the Senate and House sending letters asking the governor for a presumptive ruling, to have that happen and to have them tell us we're drafting pieces of this now. Jennifer's been contacted by several folks coming through our public affairs side that have said, called from the Capitol and said, we're drafting bills now. Look at this. Look at this section here. We're going to send it to Legislative Council. In the end, this decision, if it's not made, then the Texas legislature is going to take that decision, and they're going to make that decision for all of us. And we'll do our best to be there and be a part of that discussion. All that was ever asked for and wanted in this at all was for them to be treated fairly, and for us not to have to go case by case across time and space trying to rediscover where an infection could occur or how it occurred and the circumstances of it. That's just unfair and unjust. You don't ask a coal miner how they got black lung. That is just absolutely the Flat Earth Society belief system. It's incredibly wrong-headed, and we need to fix it. We've been nice and asked nice, and and the answer has been a resounding not at this time. So we're asking one more time, and then after this, we're going to just tell the families it's going to be up to all of us to contact your duly elected legislator and everybody in elected office, and we're going to have to put pressure on this, because it's an incredible idea that we'd even still be talking about this 6 months later.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and stay tuned on our CLEAT Facebook page for the rest of the week's events.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.